Japan, land of the rising sun and home to fascinating culture, delicious food, and stunning landscapes. But beneath the surface, life here isn't always a walk in a Zen garden. Today, we'll dive into the less talked about side of living in Japan, the scorching summers and the relentless work culture. It's a side that may challenge you, surprise you, and possibly change your perspective. Welcome to the dark side of living in Japan. 1. Apartment hunting. You won't believe how tricky it can get trying to find a place to live in Japan. Even for the locals, it's quite the roller coaster. So just imagine what a foreigner who's new to the country and its customs has to go through. To start with, you need to understand that in Japan, when it comes to renting an apartment, things can be a bit more intense than what you're used to. It's not uncommon for potential tenants to be asked to cough up several months' worth of rent up front. And just when you think you can get by the first hurdle, they throw in the request for a guarantor. Now, that's a person who is basically vouching for you and is willing to take responsibility if you fail to pay your rent. Unfortunately, things become a tad more difficult if you're a foreigner. Property owners in Japan can sometimes be a bit wary about renting out their places to foreigners. They've got these stereotypes in their heads about foreigners being too noisy, throwing wild parties, and not respecting cultural norms. And you know how in some places it's tough finding an apartment that allows pets. Well, in Japan, some apartments have an even more surprising rule. They don't allow children. But hey, every country has its unique aspects, right? This just happens to be one of Japan's. 2. Late release of gadgets. Now, here's another thing that might catch you off guard. You'd think being in Japan, the land of cutting-edge tech and all things innovative, that you'd get first dibs on the newest releases, right? Be it the latest blockbuster movie or the trendiest video game, you'd expect Japan to be at the front of the line. But believe it or not, that is not always the case. In fact, there are times when movies hit the screens in Japan as much as 6 months after their release elsewhere. So why does this happen? Well, it all boils down to prioritization. The Japanese market tends to favor homegrown products over imports. As a result, all the cool stuff from America and the rest of the West ends up on the back burner. And sometimes even games developed by Japanese studios get released in the West before they do in Japan. I mean, as a hardcore gamer in Japan, I would take a lot of pride in the fact that the game I'm waiting for comes from the same land as me. However, upon learning that people in the West have access to that same game before me, I'd be pretty bummed out. Of course, this doesn't happen to every game, but it does happen every so often, and it makes you question the integrity of the industry. 3. Natural disasters. On to something a lot less trivial than video games now. Japan is the unfortunate recipient of a lot of natural disasters. Geographically, Japan is located on what is known as the Ring of Fire. While that may sound like something out of the Lord of the Rings franchise, it's actually an area of the Pacific Ocean highly susceptible to earthquakes and volcanic activity. Now, to put that into normal words, it means that when you live in Japan, tsunamis, earthquakes, and typhoons are things that you can expect. Hell, even volcanoes erupting aren't surprising occurrences. That may sound terrifying, and that's because it is. The reality is that these disasters happen every year in Japan, and death follows them. But remember, this is part of what makes Japan such a resilient country. The people here have learned to live with these risks and to prepare for them as much as possible. But it makes you wonder, is it worth moving there? 4. Prejudice against foreigners. Something you've got to understand about Japan is that while it's known for its technological advancements and breathtaking beauty, it's also pretty homogeneous. This means that if you're not Japanese, you're going to stick out like a neon sign in a sleepy town. In many parts of the world, it's considered downright offensive to label someone based on their race. But in Japan, the line between locals and foreigners is quite distinct. They have a term for it too. If you're not Japanese, you're a gaikokujin, or even more bluntly, a gaijin, which literally translates to outsider. And trust me, this becomes all the more apparent if you find yourself in a rural area. Now, I don't mean to scare you off. This doesn't mean you'll encounter aggressive behavior or in-your-face racism. The Japanese are generally polite and respectful, but being a foreigner in Japan can mean dealing with subtle barriers and quiet reminders of your outsider status. There are more practical issues that you can crop up, like hunting for an apartment or buying a car. Sometimes these processes can be a bit more complicated simply because you're a foreigner. And this perception isn't limited to complete foreigners. Even people who are half Japanese can feel the difference. They have a label for them too, hafu. So you see, the concept of being Japanese is still somewhat limited to those who are of pure-blooded Japanese descent. It's a pretty disappointing experience, as you can guess. 5. Hard work culture. Alright, let's talk about another big part of life in Japan, the work culture. Now, when I say work culture, what I really mean is working hard, like really hard. And when I say really hard, I'm not talking about occasionally having to burn the midnight oil or giving up a weekend here or there. No. In Japan, the work-life balance tends to lean heavily towards, you guessed it, work. You know that nice, cushy 9-to-5 job we all dream of? The one where you clock out at the end of the day and forget about work till the next morning? Yeah, that's not really a thing in Japan. People are generally expected to arrive early at the office and stay late. And when I say late, it's not an extra hour or so. We're talking about hours and hours of overtime, often unpaid. This kind of overwork is so prevalent that they even have a word for death from overwork, karoshi. The culture in Japan values commitment and dedication, which is great, but at times this can morph into an unspoken rule that you must always be at your job, regardless of your health or your personal life. Say you catch a nasty flu and can barely get out of bed. In many places, you just call in sick and take the day to rest and recover. In Japan, however, the expectation is often that you'll use your vacation days rather than sick leave. Now, you may be thinking, well, at least they have vacation days, right? Yes, they do, but taking those vacation days can sometimes be seen as, let's say, less than ideal. It could be seen as a sign that you're not as committed to your job as you should be, which could affect your standing at work and even your future employment opportunities. Sounds tough, doesn't it? And the product matches the advertising. People in Japan are absolute workhorses. And if you're seriously looking to settle in Japan, you better be prepared to give up a part of your relaxation time to fit in with the culture. 6. Weather conditions. Summer is portrayed as a time to go outside and live life to the fullest by Americans, and it makes sense. They have Los Angeles, with its perfect weather year-round, and the beautiful beaches in Miami. Summers in Japan, however, are anything but perfect. So how hot is it in Japan? Well, think of a steam room, but instead of a room, it's the entire country. Just a few minutes in the heat of Japan will leave you drenched in sweat, looking like you just stepped into a waterfall. It's not something that is associated with the country, but Japan is really hot in the summer. And it's not just the high temperature that bothers you. It gets really humid in Japan. It feels like the air is heavier, and you get thirsty just by breathing. It makes your sweat sticky and just makes life uncomfortable. But comfort is the least of your worries because it can be fatal. Yeah, that's right. People die of heat strokes every year in Japan. It's a serious issue that requires actual care to avoid. That's why, if you're planning on moving to Japan, fans of some SPF 1000 sunblock won't be enough, although they certainly won't hurt. You'll need to take proper precautions and adjust your life in order to survive the heat. That means dressing appropriately. Think light, breathable fabrics and protective hats or umbrellas. 7. Public smoking. Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about something that might come as a surprise to many folks: smoking. You see, in many countries around the world, there's been a major push towards banning smoking in indoor spaces. But Japan marches to the beat of its own drum in this respect. And yes, you heard that right. Smoking indoors is A-okay in many places in Japan. Look, if you're a smoker, this must be music to your ears. After all, Japan's liberal smoking rules mean you can light up without having to step outside. But if you're a non-smoker, especially one from a country where indoor smoking is banned, it can be a bit of a jolt to the system. Sure, many restaurants in Japan do have designated smoking areas. You might think, great, problem solved. But there is a catch. Smoke doesn't really care about boundaries. It doesn't stay politely within its designated area. It travels. So, despite these separate smoking zones, you might still find yourself dealing with secondhand smoke while you're trying to enjoy your meal. Now, of course, that's not the case everywhere. Upon research, you'll find a bunch of restaurants that offer you not just delicious meals, but also atmospheres that are smoke-free. It's all part of the rich cultural experience that is Japan. And who knows, maybe Japan will change their smoking rules one day. For now, however, it's something you need to be aware of when considering moving to Japan. Makes you think, doesn't it? What are your thoughts about all of this? Let us know in the comments down below. Make sure to subscribe so you'll be the first to know about upcoming content. And buckle up, folks, because there's a lot we have in store for you.